Okay, good morning. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa program here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first event in our Africa Debate Series. This whole series was made possible for the generous support of the Open Society Foundations. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. Since the end of the Cold War, and definitely since the late 1990s, there has been, I would say, a great deal of consistency in our policy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, there's been new initiatives, there has been tweaks on the margins, but I think you can make an argument that there has been a general, clear and consistent through line over the past 2 decades. It's my view that it's incredibly important to challenge conventional thinking and approaches. We're entering a new period of strategic drift, fractured governance, and uncertainty. And there are really big questions about the U.S. willingness and capacity to solve problems abroad and at home. So it's within this framing that today we're going to launch our debate series. And over the next year, we're going to tackle trade and investment, security assistance, human rights, democracy and governance, and then foreign relations, including great power competition. But we wanted to go really big today. In 2001, Henry Kissinger wrote a book that said, "Does America need a foreign policy?" Now, he wasn't arguing for isolationism or that we should pull up our stakes, but really, what should our goals be in a new era? And staying true to ourselves, what should we accomplish? What do we need to accomplish? And today we're going to do the same. We are going to ask, does the United States need a foreign policy towards sub-Saharan Africa? And I've asked for very impressive scholars and practitioners, not all of them Africanists, to join us today and to argue on both sides of this question. I want to be very clear. This is an intellectual exercise. This is a A-team, B-team, structured analytic tool. Our goal here is not to bash the United States or the current administration. It's not even to repudiate past approaches, but really, through this debate, can we come up with new ways of advancing U.S. interests in sub-Saharan Africa? Can we innovate a new strategy? I also want to stress that our debaters here are playing parts that I assign them. They are not necessarily presenting their own personal views, but rather I've asked them to take a maximalist position so that we can get the best insights from the discussion. I've also granted them considerable amount of latitude, so they are going to position themselves around this debate in whichever way they think is the best way to present these arguments. So I think some will argue whether or not we should be leaning in or leaning back. Should the U.S. prioritize Africa relative to other regions? What are the conditions in which we should engage? And what are the policy tools that are most fitting for today's challenges and opportunities? After our 4 debaters present their arguments, we'll break for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for a panel discussion. And this is the fun part. We have an opportunity for you to vote on the key points. So we will hand out clickers, and you will be able to vote on some of the different arguments that our 4 debaters have made. And then we'll go to our panel and try to drill down on some of these questions, and our presenters will be able to present their true position on this question. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the Q&A. So without further ado, let me just introduce our speakers, and then we'll have them join me on the stage. Arguing that the U.S. needs a policy towards sub-Saharan Africa is Ambassador John Simon. He is a founding partner at Total Impact Capital. John has an impressive career in government, serving in a variety of positions under President W. Bush. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to the African Union, Executive Vice President for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Relief, Stabilization, and Development at the National Security Council, and he was a Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID. And joining him is Mande Muyangwa. She is the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program, previously the academic dean at the African Center for Strategic Studies at NDU, National Defense University. She's been a professor, a nonprofit leader, a development consultant, and a Rhodes Scholar. She's a widely cited authority on governance, security, and development issues, and perfect for this debate, she likes to challenge dominant narratives about the continent. Arguing on the other side that the U.S. does not need a policy towards the region are Chidi Odinkalo. Chidi is a Nigerian human rights activist, lawyer, professor, and writer. He was the former chair of Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission, and he's currently the senior team manager for the African program of Open Society's Justice Initiative. He has worked as an advisor for the Ford Foundation, the World Bank, the African Union, the International Council for Human Rights Policy, and many others. And in 2018, he co-wrote a book entitled Too Good to Die with Aisha Osori. And finally, Kathleen Hicks is a senior vice president, the Henry A. Kissinger Chair, that's why I quoted Kissinger for you, and director of the International Security Program at CSIS. Kath served in the Obama administration as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Policy and the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces. She led the development of the 2012 Defense Strategy Guidance and the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. She also oversaw the Department of Defense's Contingency and Theater Campaign Planning. Let me welcome my speakers to the stage.
Thank you, Judd. Thank you, my fellow debaters. Judd did assign me this position without asking, but I can say right now, while he has to play the role, in fact, I do so without any misgivings or unreservedly. It's a position I'm happy to take, and happy to take a somewhat maximalist position on it to begin with. I mean, the resolution before the floor, does the U.S. need a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa, I think is uncategorically yes. There are several reasons for this. The first one, though, and this I say is absolutely something that everyone should take into consideration, is you need a foreign policy for every region of the world, lest you upset the foreign policy gods, who absolutely punish those who neglect one region or another. This you can see when President Truman left South Korea off the list of nations that we were going to defend against communism. Within a year, South Korea, we had the South Korean War. Many of you may remember when President Bush said we would not engage in nation building, and he spent a whole 2 terms basically engaged in nation building. Some of you more recently may remember when President Obama said we would pivot to Asia, and wound up theoretically pivot to Asia out of the Middle East, and wound up being dominated in the second term by issues from the Middle East. If you say a certain part of the world is not an area of concern for us, it will be an area of concern for us. That is a sort of a theorem or a postulate of foreign policy that I think you can find proved out over and over and over again. But even if you believe that's just superstition, I think you find extraordinarily good reasons why the United States foreign policy infrastructure needs to look at Africa in a serious way and a regular way, and have a coherent policy on how to deal with the issues that come out of the continent. I am very much a subscriber still to the 2002 National Security Policy, which articulated the idea that we have more to fear from ungoverned spaces than we do from sovereign states. And unfortunately today, a lot of the ungoverned spaces that you find in the world happen to be on the African continent. Obviously, one of the big threats that come out of that, one we're only too familiar with, is terrorism, but it's not just terrorism. There's also criminal networks. There's also narcotics trafficking, human trafficking. You have a serious issue when you have a lot of these ungoverned states that they put at threat the governed areas that are near to them. That's why a big issue that we have to deal with is the emergence, and I think thankfully not just us but the world as a whole has been somewhat effective at countering this, but the emergence of narco states on the west coast of Africa. So where you have a continent that has these ungoverned spaces, you have a situation that can be an incubator for all sorts of the transnational threats that, if you look at the CIA trends analysis, are listed as the things we have to worry about, and invariably those things emerge from places where you have those areas. Where you have those areas as well, you have serious human threats to humans all over the world, and you have a very strong moral case for being present, for having a strategy to, first off, address the human ills that are there, and also with a proactive strategy to ideally mitigate and prevent them. And that's something, I think I spent most of my career on the soft side of foreign policy. And, there are a lot of folks who are the realists who say, no, we don't worry about where human suffering is. We have to worry about narrow national interest. My own view is the national interest of the U.S. is to help people in need. And where there are people in need, our population will demand that we do something. And invariably, in the past, when we have done something, that has been wholeheartedly rewarded. So we all know about the President's emergency plan to fight AIDS relief. That is one of the things that is talked most often about when people mention the Bush administration, and it is rarely talked about as something that was not a success, and it was a success because it was focused on a real problem that wasn't afflicting Americans in the same way it was afflicting Africans, but was afflicting people that Americans as a nation cared about and wanted to do something about, and felt it an imperative, a moral imperative to do that. But that moral imperative is not purely without self-interest. Out of areas, we talked about the transnational threats of trafficking and terrorism and narcotics. There's also transnational threats of pandemics, and where you allow areas to harbor and cultivate these types of things, those can, and of course, we know the hysteria that happened when Ebola occurred in West Africa, and people had to live in tents when they arrived in Newark Airport and all that sort of thing. People went crazy in Dallas. Those are things that the Ebola crisis, if it had been addressed much more proactively than it was, would have been a far smaller issue in the Mano-Cap states. Today in Eastern Congo, it could be a far smaller issue if it was addressed with a bit more rigor than it's being addressed with now. And so from a pure national security, national health policy, national interest point of view, I think the need for a policy to address the continent is clear. But there's another argument to be made, and that's the fact that Africa also happens to be a area where a lot of the world's future will be made. Africa is not only a land that has ungoverned spaces and threats, it's also a land of opportunity. It has the largest amount of untapped arable land in the world, and with a continent that's growing from 7 billion to 9 billion and needing to feed itself, that's a huge resource that needs to be recognized. It has a massive youth population. And again, that youth population can, if they don't see opportunity, can become a threat. But if they have opportunity, that's going to be an engine for global growth. It has a developing middle class that can be a huge market, and it has the potential to be a huge supplier of all sorts of goods, not just purely manufactured goods, which frankly are a challenge given the infrastructure in Africa, but intellectual goods. And in a world where you're beginning to see more and more of what we value to be in the intellectual sphere, Africa's a place that could provide a whole lot of that, both in terms of the technology spheres, but also in the cultural areas. And the last point I would make is we could make the decision not to have a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa, although, I mean, even as I say that, I find that to be sort of a very odd thing to say. It's sort of like if you left off the idea of does the U.S. need a foreign policy, left off for sub-Saharan Africa, would anyone debate that? Yes, we need a foreign policy, and if we need a foreign policy, we need a foreign policy for all the regions of the world. But even if we made the decision that we would not have one, others would not make that decision. China has a foreign policy for Africa. Europe has a foreign policy for Africa. Japan has a foreign policy for Africa. That's why African leaders go to the TCAD conference every year. That's why African leaders go to China's I think, annual or biannual conference on Africa. Europe has the same thing. We actually had one during the Obama administration. It'd be nice to have another one. That would be sort of an evidence that we, in fact, do have a foreign policy for Africa. If we do not think hard about what are the opportunities and the threats in the continent, other people will, and we are going to lose out. And in this world where we're so focused on, on America's advantages and making sure that America gets its fair share, that would be a huge loss for this country. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have Chidi argue the other side.
Good morning, and thank you very much. It's a wonderful time to be discussing foreign policy in this city at a time when foreign policy is engaging, is high politics. And high politics, particularly for buccaneers. And having listened to the ambassador, I should say I should also convey gratitude to the Center for organizing this. The motion on the floor is, does the United States need a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa? And I'd like to suggest that it does not. And the question, and in trying to make that point or build up to that suggestion, I'd like to argue or build one narrative on three anchors. One is geography, one is history, and the other is agency. There is no place like sub-Saharan Africa. It does not exist. When you ask the question, does the United States need a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa? It presumes a geospatial entity called sub-Saharan Africa. And Africa has been the victim of what I call cartographic vandalism. And the notion of sub-Saharan Africa perpetuates a history of cartographic vandalism that no policy can be founded on successfully. What exactly do I mean? And it defeats the self-interest of the United States, I'd suggest, for anyone to continue that notion that you build a policy framework with any benefit to either the United States or your partners on the African continent on the basis of this kind of vandalism. But I'll try and demonstrate this with some examples. Why is it necessary to, and I'd like to actually say that the ambassador does support, rather perversely, our point of view. Why? Because he does not speak about sub-Saharan Africa, he debated about Africa. Now, Africa is different from sub-Saharan Africa. What people call sub-Saharan Africa is 49 countries. What Africa is 54 or 55 countries, depending on how you read it. And the difference between 49 and 55 is huge in terms of policy significance. Why is that so? Let me give you the example of Egypt. Over here, people see Egypt as MENA. But what defines Egypt? The Nile. Egypt is not defined by its relationship with Israel, which is recent. Egypt is defined by the Nile. Where does the Nile begin? It begins in Central Africa, in DRC. Today, the United States is involved in trying to help who? I mean, the Nile is made up of, of course, I've oversimplified, the Nile is made up of different river courses. You've got the Blue Nile, you've got the White Nile. Most of the water comes from Ethiopia, right? Now, and it runs a course of about what? Close to 3.5 million square kilometers, that's the Nile Basin, which adds up to DRC and Nigeria put together. But that doesn't matter because we are fixated on what? Egypt and Israel. And because we are fixated on Egypt and Israel, we miss the plot. Today, what's the biggest security problem for Africa? It is Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the possibility of a war between Ethiopia and Egypt. That cannot be sorted out with the notion of what? Sub-Saharan Africa, because it breaks the entire notion, policy framework breaks down. Why does it break down? There is no Sub-Saharan Africa. You've got to engage Egypt, you've got to engage Ethiopia, and that Chinese wall breaks down. Today, the United States is engaging with that. There was an encounter here on the 6th. It's moving next to Egypt later next month, and hopefully there'll be some progress. And in engaging in that fashion, you make the point that this Chinese wall between North Africa and your Sub-Saharan Africa does not exist. It doesn't make sense. But let me give you another one. Morocco. Morocco is just 8 kilometers from Europe at the Straits of Gibraltar. And what do folks do is define that's Euromed and that's MENA. But wait a minute. In the world where we are, one of the biggest issues, of course, has been mentioned, is ungoverned spaces, terror. Who are the biggest actors? The Tijaniya movement. Where was the Tijaniya founded? 1782, Fez. And it cascaded down, right down through West Africa and down to as far as Gabon. Today, the biggest forces for moderate Islam in Africa are the Tijaniya. But we don't want to engage them because we don't have the capacity to think in those terms. So what happened? Morocco wanted to apply for ECOWAS. They did not, for ECOWAS membership. They did not go to the heads of state of West Africa. They went to the Tijaniya marabouts across West Africa. And because they do understand the historical links between what we call MENA and what we call Sub-Saharan Africa. And when the king of Morocco went around West Africa, he wasn't meeting with heads of state. He was meeting with Tijaniya leaders across the region. When they lodged their application, what happened? The region's leaders were in disagreement. The Tijaniya movement had galvanized people. Now West Africa can't take a decision. It's killed the application into the long grass and is trying to rethink membership of ECOWAS. Because people understand that the notion of Sub-Saharan Africa is unreal. It is a foreign act of cartographic vandalism. We've got to change it if you're going to get policy framework that works. But where did the cartographic vandalism begin? That is the history. This is November, 135 years ago. In Berlin, a set of white folks got together to put together to divide up a continent. No African was involved. And the meeting took place in Berlin. Bismarck hosted it, but it was the United States that started it. The United States inspired the Berlin Africa Conference, which carved up the continent. And the United States attended the Berlin Africa Conference. It did not adopt the Act of Berlin because Grover Cleveland came into power in 1885 and did not put it before Congress. But where did it start? Henry Sanford, who was, this is not the first time that buccaneers have been sent to Brussels. But Henry Sanford, who was the ambassador of Lincoln and Andrew Johnson to Brussels, was a good friend of Leopold. And Leopold deployed him to lobby Washington to recognize his claims over the Congo because that Leopold felt was the easiest way to get his claims validated. Sanford was better than effective at this. In March 1884, he got the Senate to indeed approve a resolution that the United States should recognize Leopold's claims to the Congo. That's the International African Association. And in April 1884, Chester Arthur, as president, recognized those claims. And it triggered a cascade. You had the Portuguese who were afraid that Leopold was going to go south and claim what is now Angola, went to the United Kingdom and asked the United Kingdom for help to recognize its claims over its territories in Africa. That was done. And because the United Kingdom did that, France and Germany moved the other way, aligned with the United States, and recognized Leopold's claims over the Congo. There was going to be a war, and the United States prevailed on the European powers to meet in Congo and meet in Berlin on the claim or the artifice that they were dealing with trade rights over the Congo Basin, which is how you ended up with the notion of a Congo Free State. Now, all of that resulted in a history of a continent that is carved up between different sets of people, and in which the United States has historically outsourced responsibilities for decision making. And that's really part of the problem. So if you want to deal with Nigeria, Kenya, go to the Brits. We outsource it to the Brits, and whatever they do is fine. If you want to deal with Mali, whoever, outsource it to the French, and that will be just fine. And now, what's happened with this? You lack policy coherence because you lack geospatial coherence. The only people who understand the need for this coherence are who? The terrorists, increasingly. So, Mokhtar Belmokhtar in Algeria is doing business with who? As Akim is doing business with who? Boko Haram, Abubakar Shekau in Nigeria. They know that those spaces are permeable. We don't. We've installed Chinese walls. And it seems to me, so Al-Murabitun is doing business with who? They are doing business with Ansaru. Now, if we cannot break these down, we will not be able to deal with what the ambassador has, in my view, rightfully called ungoverned spaces. Because those ungoverned spaces don't recognize sub-Saharan Africa. They do recognize Africa. And let me finish with a final point, agency. And I said, just not too far away from here, a famous ambassador is going to be has taken an oath this morning to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And as I said, that is not the first example of a buccaneer who went to Brussels and discovered that he could do business as they wanted. Policy making in Africa has been left to buccaneers. Since Henry Sanford engaged Henry Morton Stanley in 1878 to go around Africa collecting treaties. And that's really what's happened. And so the agency issue is huge. The United States outsourced policy making to Mobutu in Africa. And what did Mobutu do? Mobutu misled the most powerful country into the world, into the misadventure on Angola. And Mobutu was related to Holden Roberto, who was the leader of the FNLA by marriage. And indeed, Holden Roberto came from the DRC. And Mobutu was an agent or a satellite of the United States. And the United States went into Angola with Mobutu, misled by a man who had other interests. And you see these buccaneers everywhere, people to whom, what I call amigo diplomacy. The three amigos are now a very popular expression here. Amigo diplomacy is no longer possible for Africa. Look at it this way. How did Somalia go bad? Because the most powerful country in the world wanted to outsource fixing a terrible situation to an amigo, Farah Aidid. And you don't do that, but you will do that if you continue to believe that there is something like sub-Saharan Africa. There is an Africa, and the United States can think of policy making for Africa, a continent that is coherent, a continent that needs the United States as a partner, a continent whose people appreciate the role of the United States in the world. If, however, you choose to continue with the notion of sub-Saharan Africa, you'll be shooting yourself in the foot, and the United States will only have itself to blame. Thank you.
Okay, Monday, you have the challenge of following Chidi.
All right. So I The motion is, does the United States need a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa? And I want to join Ambassador Simon in arguing in the affirmative. Of course, the United States needs a policy towards Africa. At the risk of stating the obvious, if foreign policy is all about strategies and approaches that a country utilizes to safeguard its national interests and to achieve its goals within the global realm, then the United States definitely needs a policy towards Africa. If not for the simple reason that Africa exists, as both speakers have outlined here this morning. But beyond its mere existence, and much of what I'm going to say here today is just reinforcing many of the points that Ambassador Simon has already made. I think it would be folly not to have a policy towards a region that represents 54, 55 countries, has a population of 1 billion people, a variety of natural resources that have fueled the development of the world for centuries and continue to do so today. It would be folly not to have a policy towards the continent that is as complex as it is large, a continent that is transforming in ways that will impact not just the future of that continent, but also the future of this country. It would be folly also not to have a policy towards Africa. Africa is forever historically tied to and embedded in the very DNA of this country, where 13% of the US population is of African descent. In many ways, I would argue that not having a policy, a comprehensive policy, impacts race relations in this country as well. The second point that I would like to argue on why the United States needs a policy towards Africa is that from my vantage point, US policy has largely, not exclusively, but largely been driven by Africa's challenges, be they in the security realm, the development realm, or the governance realm. And Ambassador Simon talked about those. Don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing that the United States should not have focused on these challenges. These were very real challenges for the continent, and in some cases, the challenges posed a direct security threat to the United States. We think, for example, about the HIV epidemic that Ambassador Simon has already talked about, threatened many parts of the continent, including Southern Africa, where my family is from, where governance was threatened, economic devastation loomed, and the disease threatened to tear apart the very social fabric of many countries in Southern Africa. The Bush administration's PEPFAR program has saved many lives on the continent. Think also of the United States' role in combating the conflict that broke out in West Africa in the 1990s that threatened to consume the entire sub-region. And of the United States' engagement in the war against terror and countering violent extremism, particularly after the bombings of the US embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. So the United States has played a key role in Africa, has had a policy towards Africa, but my big point here is that it has been engaged mostly around the negatives and the challenges. This brings me to my third point, that the United States needs a more robust and cohesive policy towards Africa, one that is better connected to the transformation that is taking place in many parts of the continent. I say this because as I look across several administrations, what I see is a policy towards Africa that has been slow and rather anemic in expanding its framework to engage with the opportunities presented by the transformation that Africa offers. And as a result, our foreign policy is still engaging with an Africa that's largely on the margins of US policy. The key culprit, from my perspective, has been the enduring narrative of a troubled Africa, the problem child in the global arena. And that negative narrative has clouded our ability to see and understand the transformation and how to engage with it in a more timely manner. It has clouded our ability to understand how the transformation impacts our interests on the continent. So in the economic space, for instance, we see countries that are performing quite well, creating strong ease of doing business environments, spreading technology and using technology in a way that reinforces good governance and fosters development. I think here of Kenya's Silicon Savannah, for instance. I see a large entrepreneurial spirit in many parts of the continent that we have not tapped into adequately. We see several countries fighting corruption. No doubt, we have engaged with some of these opportunities, but not in the big, transformative way that US-Africa policy could have engaged. I look at the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, for instance, passed in 2000 as our main trade engagement tool with the African continent. AGOA has been renewed, and that's a great thing. But when 2019, and it remains the anchor of our trade relations with the continent, even though we are building infrastructure around that. And that is also a good thing. So we see the Obama administration in particular opening up the framework to bring in more of that economic engagement. We see the Trump administration now moving forward with Prosper Africa, with the new International Development Finance Corporation and other such measures. That's a step in the right direction. My primary point, though, is we moved too slowly. And as a result, today, we are Africa's third largest trading partner behind the Chinese and the European Union. So there is an opportunity cost for not seeing Africa for what it is. And we're playing catch up at this point. And I think part of what we need is to understand the drivers of the transformation that's occurring on the continent, as well as the amplifiers of that transformation that we could engage with through our foreign policy in order to achieve our stated objectives. There's also negative transformation. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything in Africa that's happening in Africa on the transformation side is good. One of the things I worry about is the rise in procedural democracy through the holding of regular elections. You see this across many African countries, and that's a good thing. But we also see a decline in qualitative democracy and good governance, where people's rights and civil society space is being diminished. That's not a good thing. And so how do we shift? Should we shift our policy? I think too often international partners give African countries a pass. You held elections, good, you're on the path to democracy. It's much more than that. How do we focus more on what's happening in between elections to promote the good governance and the qualitative democracy that so many ordinary African citizens are yearning for? That's a key part of what our policy needs to be looking at from my perspective. Governance is the anchor of so much of the good that's happening on the African continent. And to the extent that we can amplify the good stuff that's taking place in that space, I think it puts us on a really, really good trajectory. My fifth point, and I have two more. Judd, you're looking at me, right? Okay. My fifth point is that I believe that the United States policy could be stronger in aligning with the interests of ordinary Africans around common goals that may be differently defined or prioritized on the African continent. Let me give you an example. I was in South Africa earlier this year for an Africa Day conference involving many Africans from across the continent. I was struck by the dissonance between US security priorities in Africa, with its heavy focus on countering violent extremism, and the typology of insecurity that was presented by the Africans at the conference. They focused on the things that threaten their day-to-day security and well-being. And what I noticed in listening to him was, for many countries, or for many participants, I should say, countering violent extremism was halfway down or near the bottom. It was other issues that threatened their day-to-day well-being. So how do we craft a policy that allows us to address our interests in countering violent extremism, but also the issues that impact ordinary Africans and makes them feel insecure? If our objective is to address insecurity on the African continent, then we need to understand it in all of its forms. My 6 points, which I think both of our speakers have made, is that there's been an influx of international actors in Africa over the last couple of decades. And it is clear that Africa has more choices than it had previously. I know that in this country, there's great concern on the policy domain about China-Africa relations. That's fine. But I also think our policy needs to also hear how Africans perceive both Chinese policy and US policy. Africa was the major battleground for the last Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Those effects continue to linger today. When I talk to Africans, I hear concern about the way foreign policy is being framed around China's role in Africa. And the concern there is, as they say, they do not want to see a Cold War Part 2, because they're going to bear the brunt of that Cold War Part 2 between the United States and China if it does occur. Or, as they succinctly put it, when two elephants fight, it is usually the grass that suffers. So even as we raise concerns about China's engagement in Africa, some of it not good, some of it obviously adding value, thinking about the modalities for engagement on those things that threaten the US interests in Africa around Chinese engagement, I think would be a helpful approach as well. And finally, and this is a point that Ambassador Simon made, so I want to end on this point, that foreign policy is both about substance and symbolism. Taking a leaf out of how some of the international actors in Africa are engaging, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and others, the respect that so many African leaders see them being given through the senior level engagement is part and parcel of foreign policy. Ambassador Simon mentioned that we've not had an African Leaders Summit since 2014. Africans see that and interpret that to mean Africa does not matter to the United States, no matter how solid and good the substance might be. And so thinking through how we craft a foreign policy that brings both substance, symbolism, partnership together, I think will put us in a better place in terms of securing US national interests for the future. Thank you.
Okay, our final debater is Kath Hicks.
All right, thanks very much to everyone, and I'd like to particularly thank Judd for this challenge to support the lack of any U.S. foreign policy as a foreign policy practitioner. But here we go. So let's take it as a given that Africa is vibrant. Africa is important. There are ties economically that are growing. There are ties societally that tie Africa to the United States. Those are all true. But I have some rebuttals to various of the items mentioned by the affirmative here today. And I think I'll start with, just sort of outline for you what they're going to be. The first is that Africa's doing pretty well with Africans in the lead. The second is, let's face it, the United States is pretty incompetent. So all the nice ideas about how we could execute an effective foreign policy in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, we're not going to do. We're probably going to mess it up. And the third is, we really can't afford it anyway. So it's time for others to share the burden, and it's great that others in the world are also noticing Africa. So let me walk through a couple of these. The first is, Africans are doing pretty well for themselves. They're doing pretty well economically, they're doing pretty well in the security realm, and they're doing pretty well on the democracy front. On security, we have AMISOM in Somalia fighting al-Shabaab. We have 5 African governments in the Sahel for the G5 Sahel Joint Force doing counter-extremism in West Africa. And these African-led initiatives are great examples of when Africans can lead in Africa, they can do really incredible things. They also understand regional integration in ways, as Chidi pointed out, the United States clearly has been incompetent in its ability to do, as we tend to divide between MENA and sub-Saharan Africa. But Africans don't have that challenge. They understand the continent, and they understand relations across the continent. So in April 2019, you had 22 countries ratify the African Continental Free Trade Area, and you also, therefore, had successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area with a combined consumer and business spending of $6.7 trillion by 2030. You have Africans pressing for democratic reforms, and quite successfully so. You have a very high percent in polling of Africans who support democracy, 68%, and with very little interaction with the United States, and perhaps because very little interaction with the United States, you had 27 handovers of power in the region since 2015, about half of which featured an opposition candidate defeating a member of the incumbent party, which is a feat, to say the least, for Africa. So let me get really to the heart of my views as the non-Africanist on stage, which is we're pretty incompetent in foreign policy. If that isn't amply demonstrated on a daily basis, let me give you a few other ways to think about this. The first is that we over-militarize everything, right? So ideally, our approach to Africa or sub-Saharan Africa would have this great preventive approach. We would be focused on development assistance. We'd be focused on issues like global health. That's not how we do foreign policy here. What we tend to do, of course, is overextend the military arm. Of course, we focus on the threats. If you want a U.S. foreign policy for Africa, it's going to stay focused on the threats. That's not healthy for Africa. There are all these other factors we just talked about that are the real heart and soul of where Africa is headed in the future, and we will, instead, we will focus really on the security piece. Why not better for the United States to focus that security energy on protecting its own population, whether it's at the border or if you think about the forward borders through its various customs and border protection approaches. And it can do so through other means, again, that are not specifically about a policy or a foreign policy for Africa. We also, we can't get taxpayers' focus on these big long-term. This is why we over-militarize, right? Because what taxpayers don't want to engage in a lot of their investment in these long-enduring growth proposals overseas. Instead, what they want to do, if anything, is intervene in a crisis in sporadic way. This leads to incredible unpredictability in foreign policy. Again, not very healthy for Africa as we wax and wane in terms of what exactly interests us at any given time. I think also in terms of that sense of how the United States does, we are very much looking for burden sharers. And you've heard ample conversation today about some of those other countries that, first of all, may have a better understanding of the region, both within the region and beyond. And you also have actors like China who are getting engaged in Africa. And I say, let the Chinese get engaged in Africa. The United States shouldn't be looking for a Chinese specter everywhere, and we can't afford to. So to the extent that we should lean forward in Africa, which I think we should for all the reasons I said at the beginning, a vibrant economy, et cetera, What we ought to be doing really is focusing on those societal ties that transcend foreign policy. They're really about community to community, family to family, and we should be focused on the economic, the unfettered wisdom of the free market to allow the United States companies to be engaged as best they can to grow out their commerce with Africa. That should be the focus of what we're doing. Let me actually walk through in a little more detail some responses to specific things raised here today. So one example that was raised very early on is that if we've learned the hard lesson in U.S. foreign policy that if we ignore a region, it will come back to bite us. And that's true, but that's because of our instincts in the past. We need to change those instincts, right? So we should get away from this idea that every time a crisis occurs in the world or every time there's a threat to U.S. security, we need to respond in a heavy-handed way. If we continue to focus on these big, broad foreign policy goals overseas, including in Africa, but not limited to Africa, we will tend to overreact like that. We don't need to do that. We need to make hard choices. We don't have a lot of funds to expend, and we have a lot of investment priorities here at home. Also raised, as I mentioned before, are concerns around issues like counterterrorism, other threats, even issues like pandemics. Again, I think understandably these are global challenges. Others ought to be sharing the burden of those challenges, and the United States is best suited to focusing its energies on preventing those challenges from getting to us inside our own borders. I see the economic potential, for sure, of Africa. And again, I think the key for the United States is making sure we have a very limited foreign policy footprint. We're getting more money into to the taxpayer, and the free market is able, the companies are able to do business in Africa as appropriate. I think some of the other things that have come up are the issue of, let's see, what was this one? Oh, the idea of countries are, doing well and they're focused on good governance. I assure you, if the United States gets involved, as Chidi pointed out, we are very likely to pick the wrong actors. The amigo diplomacy approach of the United States is very likely to continue. We don't understand regional dynamics, inside country dynamics particularly well, and we have a tendency to try to bet on certain leaders at certain points in time. That generally comes back to bite us. It's actually worse for U.S. foreign policy. We'll have a worse reputation in the region if we try to execute a foreign policy for which we are in no way equipped. I think those are the key things I want to convey today. And again, Judd, thanks very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, we are going to pause for a 15-minute break while my team figures out which questions and points you're going to vote on, and then we'll come back for a panel discussion. Thank you so much. Okay, welcome back. This is the interactive part of today's session. You should all have clickers we gave you. You just have to press the on button, get a nice green light. For those of you who are watching live stream, these will show up at CSIS Africa, and you can vote on a poll online as well with us. So we're going to do first just a test run. That just tells you to turn the power button on. A will be for agree, and B will be for disagree. And here is the first question. This is just to make sure we're all using these tools right. The sky is blue. Agree or disagree? We're going to work the technical part of it. There we go. So vote A or B. Okay, everyone has weighed in or decided to weigh on the color of the sky. For this particular question, it doesn't matter. You can change your vote. Watch, B. So you can change your vote until we sort of say pause. Everyone has got the hang of it? Nothing. Okay, Marielle, do you want to go to our first question? There is a strong moral case for engaging sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, there is no D. Okay, 85% agree with Ambassador Simon's argument that there is a strong moral case for engaging with sub-Saharan Africa. Let's go to point 2. The U.S. national interest is to help people in need. Okay, I think that we have about 64 or 59% for and 41% against. Let's move to point 3. The sub-Saharan Africa is an imagined region stemming from cartographic vandalism. TD, you're doing pretty well. Is C none of the above, or you opt out? Okay, 42% or 62% disagree that sub-Saharan Africa is an imagined region stemming from cartographic vandalism. Point 4. The U.S. has outsourced its policy to other countries and problematic leaders. Yeah. For the value of an intellectual exercise, there's only yes and no. 87% agree with Chidi. Okay, let's go to point 5. The U.S. is moving too slowly in its policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, playing catch-up with other countries. Okay, that's a dramatic 85% from Monday's point. Let's go to point 6. In its policy, the U.S. should prioritize uplifting the interests of everyday Africans. Okay, 76%, and someone said none of the above. Okay, point 7. Africans do not need U.S. help. They are doing well on security, democracy, and economic reform. Okay, 80% disagree with that statement. Point number 8. The U.S. over-militarized its approach to foreign policy. or 85%, excuse me. Point 9. The U.S. is at risk of choosing wrong actors to work with. Okay, 87%. And I think our final question, our final point is the U.S. should worry less about Chinese engagement in Africa. We had to end on this question. Wow, that's really interesting. So we've got 57 that disagree and 43% that agree. Okay, and those of you who are watching at home, you can vote on at CSIS Africa for the poll. It will be up for 5 days. Okay, let's move to the panel. All right, we gave everyone a lot to think about. Thank you for your audience participation. I want to make sure that I give our panelists the opportunity to tell us what they really think. So why don't we start on our left, and we can just go across just a brief sentence if you have anything you want to clarify that represents Chidi or Kath or Monday or John and not necessarily the parts you played.
Sorry, Judd, I didn't know you were a leftist. Look, quite clearly, it's not sustainable intellectually or practically to say that the United States does not need a foreign policy towards Africa. In a real world, I don't think anybody can realistically say that, which does not mean that there isn't room to either rethink, make it more constructive, or to reboot, as a matter of fact. Governments will come and governments will go, but these United States are likely to be here for a heck of a long time still. Again, the African geopolitical space is going to be there. There are issues on which clearly both parts do need partnerships. And it's not just the African side or the American side, but a lot of the real estate in between, which is the European side. But I genuinely, however, do think that we should rethink the notion of sub-Saharan Africa. I quite firmly believe that. And I think that if that notion is rethought, you could actually get greater payoff for U.S. policy on Africa. And it seems to me actually that in those places where you've managed to bridge that manufactured divide between MENA and the rest of Africa, you've tended to have greater success. And where you've failed, like in Libya, a lot of people think chasing away Gaddafi was a great thing. I cannot sit down here and say Gaddafi was the best thing that, since sliced bread. That's just not sustainable. But was it possible, in the manner that Gaddafi was removed, to have done a little more to make sure that the violent cascade that's followed was stopped. It was foreseeable. I foresaw it. I spoke with my own government about it. Nigeria at that time was on the Security Council, and I said, look, before you do this vote, be careful. I went to the presidency and I told them, before you do this vote, be careful, because you are going to end up with a basket of rotten eggs on your laps. That was very foreseeable. Now, is it any wonder that since then you've had what's happened with Mali, you've had the escalation with Boko Haram, you've got this massive traffic, and you can see the supply routes for all of the hardware coming in and the traffic going on in that neighborhood. Now, I do think it's irresponsible that policymakers are unwilling or unable to deal with the foreseeable consequences of these kinds of decisions. And that's partly from this notion of, well, you're either a Middle East expert or a sub-Saharan Africa expert. You know, let me just end on this note. Sub-Saharan Africa, or what is called sub-Saharan Africa, is actually not one country. And I know that, you know, I remember the first time I went to San Francisco, somebody stopped me on the road and asked me where I came from. I said I was from this place in Africa. And, you know, the person wanted to know whether I knew their friend who came from another country that happened to be Burkina Faso. I was glad that the person knew Africa, but, you know, quite clearly there's a problem. That mindset still persists, you know, of thinking of Africa as one country. I know it may not be there in people who do policy, but I do think also that a lot of it, and to be fair, African leaders also have not helped it, you know. China-Africa summit, and you have 43 African heads of state go there, and Turkey-Africa summit. And I was hoping one of these days you'll have New York Africa Summit, because New York City has a bigger economy than Russia. And if Russia is inviting African leaders, there's no reason why the mayor of New York cannot invite African leaders. The sad thing is that we never have 43 African presidents for the African Union Summit. And yet, 43 can traipse off from Africa, go to Russia, and spend nearly 1 week. That is a terrible thing, and I do hope part of this is also to ask for responsible leadership on the African side, because when you have that, it makes it much easier to have responsible policy making from this side. Thank you.
Yes, I having put forward the incompetence defense second only to the Twinkie defense in its compelling nature, I do believe the United States needs a rational, long-term focused vision for its foreign policy toward Africa, and I think it was very well presented here at the table by the other three presenters. I did learn from Chidi's point, which I think is a good one for the United States, that we really suboptimize when we divide ourselves between what is really a very security-focused conversation around North Africa and tying it through in a MENA context, and this idea of a sort of a more development-focused, if you will, sub-Saharan Africa. And that division, even though I was playing a role, you can see some of those arguments I made play out in reality, which is the attention and the money and the focus goes on MENA. Because that is reality of how the United States has, generally speaking, conducted its foreign policy. But I think the PEPFAR example was a great one, and Mondi had a number as well, where the United States has succeeded and can use, you know, with leadership, can really make a difference in terms of the lives of everyday Africans, in terms of its own national security interests with regard to all kinds of things, from security to global health, et cetera. So that's where I am.
Okay. Thanks, Kath. Monday?
My position, obviously, is that the United States does need policy towards Africa, and I join Chidi in this. This has been a position of mine for many years, having served within the U.S. government for over 18 years now, that I don't think this divide between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa is very helpful. I think it's challenging. It delays coordination and understanding the full picture of what's going on. The security challenges, has already been pointed out, that exist in North Africa do not automatically stop when they get to the Sahel. Hence, we have the issues that are ongoing in the Sahel today. So I know we have the mechanisms within the U.S. government of thinking through that and working together, but I think it's unnecessary. And that rethinking that is really important. The second issue for me has to do with following up on that. African forces are moving towards integration, right? So as you look across the continent, the forces in Africa, how do we cooperate? How do we integrate as a continent? Notwithstanding what's going on with, the Brexit and America First and everything else. In general, when you look at the continent, the whole issue is let's cooperate and integrate so we can realize economies of scale and all of that good stuff. I think that has huge implications, both in terms of our continued, artificial division between sub-Saharan Africa. I think there are Africans who would interpret that to mean the U.S. is continuing to try and break up the forces of integration that we are trying to foster. And I know that's not the case, but definitely that perception is there, that why not join us in our fight to integrate the continent? So there are also those consequences and interpretations that I think we need to look at. It was an African president who said, I had the opportunity of sitting down with a number of African presidents who said, U.S. policy towards Africa is not bold enough. And I happen to share that perspective. I think there are plenty of opportunities here based on the discussion that we've had here to really amplify. I'm not saying get rid of the national interests that we have, but there are plenty of opportunities here to engage with Africa and amplify the positives that can come to both Africa and the United States by really stepping back and understanding the transformation that's going on the African continent. If I hear one more person talk to me as if Africa is one country, if I hear one more person talk to me about the corruption in Africa, I'm not saying that those issues don't exist, but really understanding there are 4 African countries in the top 50 in terms of how well they're addressing the corruption issue. Top 50 in the world. There are 6 African countries that are leading the economic reforms that they're putting in place to create these business-friendly environments. You have 12 African countries that are at the forefront of contributing troops to UN peace support operations. 12 of the top 20 African countries. You have Silicon Savannah in the Kenya area, where there are over 200 US dollar millionaires in that space who are working in the technology space and are using this technology to help improve governance, to help address some of the health and other development challenges that the continent has. You have a number of African countries that are leading in terms of the number of women in parliament. How are we engaging with that to help normalize some of these governance issues that we would like to see normalized? And so you have all of this that's happening on the African continent, and really just stepping back and thinking through how can we better engage to achieve US national interest, to partner with Africa in a way that becomes a win-win situation for the Africans and for the United States. I think those are all key issues that we need to be looking at as a country. So I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Judd. And first and foremost, I want to congratulate Chidi and Kath. They argued their position far better than I could ever have envisioned. So, I thought we had a very easy time here, and they made it a lot tougher than I could imagine. I just want to address three points they made that I think are very salient and have a lot of truth in them, and sort of how they might fit into a sort of more nuanced Africa policy than the one we've all had to take for the purposes of debate. First off, Chidi, absolutely your point on the fact that the divide between sub-Saharan Africa and Africa as a whole, is not one that should be adopted in all cases. I mean, I was the permanent representative to an organization that looked at the continent as a whole. And there are clearly, if you think about security issues, the ties between North Africa and West Africa are in many ways much closer than they are between West Africa and East Africa. That being said, you do have to draw these lines somewhere. And I do think there is a relevant divide at the Sahara for a lot of purposes, not for all purposes. You just have to you have to think. You have to make sure that the policy framework you adopt, enlightens certain things but doesn't blind you to others. And the connections between the North and the South need to be things that, if you draw those lines at that point, you're aware of. If you drew the line elsewhere, if you drew the line at the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, you would have to be aware of the connections between North Africa and the Middle East and North Africa and Europe that you wouldn't necessarily be taken into account in a policy framework. So wherever you draw that line, there are going to be these connections that are there. I mean, interestingly, obviously, in East Africa, there are connections to the Middle East that are often ignored and vitally important. I think the other point that Kath made that is worth thinking a little about is this idea that, Africa's doing pretty well and we don't want to screw that up. And I absolutely think we should endorse the concept that Africa has made tremendous strides over the past years, and in many instances, Silicon Savannah is one of them, is leapfrogging ahead. That being said, I think there is a desire in the continent for partnership, and what we need to do is structure a policy that is about partnership, not about imposing our views of what should happen in Africa on other folks. And, I do think if you look at some of the examples you gave, Kath, Amazon, the Sahel Security Partnership, these are actually areas that are good examples of that. Amazon is very much an African-led, African-fought mission that's done incredible work. It received important support from the United States and from others. That was a function of, I think, a pretty good policy at the time. And as in all foreign policy, it's rare that you have unmitigated success. You always have to move, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back at the best. But I do think there are a number of examples, obviously PEPFAR is another one that I would cite, where we've actually been able to implement policy in a positive partnership type framework, and that is certainly something we should try and emulate in the type of robust policy that you talked about, Mondi. The last point I'd make is, this idea that we do have to make choices, and that I think is, just as it's sort of a truism that we need a foreign policy, it is a truism that you can't be all things to all people. That being said, I think a policy is not just about dollars. And part of, I think, one of the problems with our African policy is too often we've just defined it in terms of dollars. A lot of the issues you mentioned, Mondi, trade relationships, cultural relationships, technology relationships, these are things that can happen with relatively little amounts of money. And I think part of what a robust policy would be about, would help us do, is identify those areas where we can make a lot of progress and not necessarily deplete our resources that could be used elsewhere. So I mean, those are the last points. But like I say, it was a really wonderful discussion. And I think there's a whole lot that was brought out that I think can certainly anyone who is fashioning Africa policy today needs to take into account.
Thanks, John. One of the points of this debate and the 3 others that we will do throughout the year is constructing a new approach, or at the minimum, validating and revalidating what we do. And so I'd like to take maybe just one round. I'll ask Chidi this question, and then I'll turn it to Monday for the sort of the flip side of it is, in your mind, what has worked? What are if we were starting over and building a new policy towards Africa, I didn't say sub-Saharan Africa, if we were building a new policy, what were the things that have worked and that we would want to either retain or even double down on?
What's worked? The question is for whom?
Well, I think you can take it both sides.
Well, I know. I suspected that was going to be a comeback. It seems to me that that's a framework that's got to be engrafted into the question what's worked. I think somebody has talked about, a lot has been said here between Kath and the ambassador about PEPFAR. It seems to me that where U.S. policy has focused on the human angle, on people, that there's been a throughput for all sides, and in respect of which all sides can claim credit. You've also had, and where there's been, I don't know, if I could use the expression desecuritization. Everybody likes to see Africa as a place where you go to dump arms. And it's very interesting. We don't sell strategic hardware. We sell small arms and light weapons. And who are the people that are killed with small arms and light weapons? People like me. People like the ordinary African. Our ancestors, our grandparents, our children are the people who are shot. And who are the people who are shooting us? They're invariably the people who actually, under law, have a right to shoot people, uniformed assets of the state. Who are they turning the guns on? Citizens of Africa. Where do they get the guns from? We don't make guns in Africa. And so they get the guns from places like, Russia, and the United States believes, so, well, if the Russians are selling it, let's sell it too. And Russians believe if the Americans are selling it, let's sell it too. And the French believe, well, if the Americans and the Russians are selling it, we sell it too. And so increasingly, the ambassador told us how Africa has got all these assets in arable land, in human assets, and in the youth bulge, from which we can get a dividend. But most people are not seeing that. Most of these people who are selling these hardware, the small arms and light weapons, are not seeing that. So there's been good payoff in trade, it seems to me, no matter how limited it is. But and now that we've got the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, there is something there that there's a framework that it seems to me that we could quite easily take a look at. There's been some progress, halting at times, and currently not much in evidence in governance. And much of the progress that has been made in governance, I think, has been made in spite of, increasingly, rather than because of some of the policy people out here. And you see what's happening, for instance, in Guinea, where a president wants to kill his people because he wants to rule until the day after eternity. Now, that kind of thing poses a problem. And you see, that's one of the places where the current Secretary of State has said no, actually, to his credit. I think it's important to say that. He says, no, this man should do his tenure and leave. So these are some of the areas, it seems to me, where there's been some progress. And it seems to me the U.S. is part of the impetus towards the Africa CDC. I think the point was made about Ebola and what's transpired. And one of the responses to Ebola has been the Africa CDC, which is now at the African Union headquarters in Addis. And the African CDC is the biggest area of investment in many ways now at the African Union. The potentials are very immense. They may not be seen immediately, but you can see that there is tremendous possibility with that. So it seems to me there are areas quite clearly in which there have been positive investments. Monday has also pointed to some of that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so Monday, you said that we need to be bolder. So maybe you could share what you think has been meek and what you think really should be retired as a policy approach. What is not working in your mind?
How much trouble do I want to get into? Let me start with something that I think supports Africa policy very well. I think the bipartisan support that Africa enjoys in Congress has been very helpful. Africa is not the Middle East. where everybody's fighting over everything. And so that has really, really helped. And the small but really engaged Africa-focused constituency, I think, has also been quite effective. I go back to its role in AGOA and all of that. So there is an engaged constituency. There is bipartisan support, and I think expanding on both of those, I think, would be very helpful, or retaining those and building on them would be very helpful. What has not worked? I talked about some of the stuff that I think I would be concerned about in terms of how we make U.S. policy bolder. Let me start with security. Obviously, we have huge security concerns on the African continent, in various parts of the African continent. I would never take away from that. But I think one of the things that we probably ought to look at is there is concern in some quarters that sometimes we prioritize security over the governance dimension, particularly when you look at some of our key partners on the security issue. So how do we develop a policy that allows the U.S. to engage on those security issues, but also to bolster the governance, create some conditionalities that doesn't take away from or diminish the governance aspect of it, the democratic governance. There's a lot of concern on the African continent about that. Specifically, there's the perception that the U.S. sometimes privileges security over democratic governance. And the fact that, as Neil was pointing out to me during the break, that it is on the backs of good, strong governance that Africa is going to continue making this transformation. So whenever that governance aspect is diminished, particularly on what we call anchor countries, that has a resonating effect across the continent. And so that's, I think, one piece of it. And then somebody else raises perception about the over-militarization. What I would say there is engage with the human dimension. I think that Chidi was talking about, so that it's not just looking at, let's go kill the terrorists, that's an important part of it, but also how do we bolster human security in the communities that are most impacted. That will be a key piece of it. Look, and I know that there are entities at the Department of State, DOD, that are looking into these issues, USAID even, but I don't think it's comprehensive enough in terms of how it's knit together to be able to have the sort of impact that we're looking at. Some of the biggest transformation that we've looked at, honestly, I just think we can do more to expand the economic engagement with the African continent. We are lagging so far behind, I sometimes sit here and say, why aren't we seeing these opportunities that exist? That's a win-win situation, whether you're engaging with African youth, whether you're engaging with women, whether you're engaging with countries that continue to make those reforms that allow ordinary African citizens to thrive. That is really, really important, and we can do more. I know we're doing some. I'm still not convinced that that is sufficient. The fourth thing that has not worked for me is I think sometimes we're in panic mode about what these other actors are doing on the African continent. Not really stepping back to say, okay, what are their interests, how are they engaging in Africa, and how is their engagement either undermining our policy and our interests, or how is their engagement affording us an opportunity to partner with them on an issue that we care about. I think more of that, from my perspective, needs to happen. As I get older, let me conclude with this. People are Africa's biggest and best resource. We talk a lot about youth who are really going to drive the future of that continent. I don't think we nearly do enough to think through what does an Africa 30 years from now look like? Who are going to be the drivers of that vision that we have for Africa? And it's not people like me, it's not people like Chidi, it's going to be this youth group. So what are the investments that we make into the youth to allow us to achieve this Africa of 30 years that we are envisioning on both the African and the US side? We don't pay nearly enough attention to that issue. I see ministers of defense coming through Washington. I see ministers of health coming through Washington. I would love to see the education component really step back. How do we educate for the Africa we would like to see, not for the Africa that was? That's a fundamental question. And it revolves around how we engage with youth. That, to me, is a missing piece. We have the YALIs, we have programs, but I just don't think we are dealing with the systemic issues that we really, really need to deal with in order to realize the full benefit of that.
Thanks, Monday. So I invited Kat to join us today because you have much for torture to ask her to make an uncomfortable argument. No, because Kat has in your previous positions, global portfolio. And so some of us spend all of our time either sub-Saharan Africa or Africa, but you have this bigger perspective. And I thought it might be useful for you to share a little bit of what you've seen worked in other regions and what has been sort of, whether you want to call it innovations or just underlining principles that aren't applied to Africa and maybe should be, because it would help us have a more beneficial policy for both the U.S. and our African counterparts.
Yeah, I think I would go to one thing, which is a sustained interaction at the civil society level, at the community level. And I can't speak to, I don't wish to, cast any aspersions. That may be exactly where the United States has focused its diplomatic and development efforts in particular on Africa. But I think that's the key at the base of all successful U.S. foreign policy, is that sustained over time quality, depth of engagement where we're actually listening and understanding these sorts of things that Mani just mentioned, sort of what are the generational trend lines, the impact areas, the drivers that really make a difference, and that can kind of be brought back to that global perspective as we weigh across. That's not all government in the U.S., right? So this gets beyond the government-to-government piece, and some of what I said, I think, is in fact reflective of the reality that you have, of course, philanthropic organizations, but also the business community, also familial relations, community connections. All of that is good, and in parts of the world where we've really invested in those, where we have a strong history that's rich, you can see the payoff of that, even in congressional districts, the things that matter in domestic politics on foreign policy, where that has a cyclical or a effect back into how the United States thinks about different regions of the world.
John, I'm going to ask you maybe the flip side. Are there things that you have seen that seem idiosyncratic to the region that perhaps we need to take a different look at? What in your mind is sort of out of date and needs to be refreshed?
Yeah. So I mean, those may be two different questions: what's out of date, and what's idiosyncratic. I do think, and again, some of these things are changing as we speak. So it's not as if we're all in one place and all in another. But for instance, I'm a little biased in this, but I do think we've had in our foreign policy approach very much a country-by-country approach, and have given relatively short shrift to the continental institutions that could craft a more holistic, comprehensive approach. So, I was the second U.S. ambassador to the African Union. That was, I think, a big step forward, but I think we could do a lot more to work with the AU on a more in more of a partnership approach. I think we do a lot more to work with the regional economic communities in that regard, and do so, like I say, as partners, not as our relationship is often defined at the country level just by how much aid we give. I do think, we talked a lot about PEPFAR, and I think PEPFAR was a wonderful effort in terms of its ability to address the scourge of HIV, but now most African countries have committed to universal health care. And we should be thinking about how we create partnerships to help make that happen, help them not make many of the same mistakes we made, figure out if there are ways that they can use technology use sort of different types of financing mechanisms to provide a basic healthcare package to a lot of folks on a systematic level. And I guess I would argue in a whole number of areas, there are places where we need to get out of the stovepipe and think more about systems. I think that's true in our trade relations. I think Mondi mentioned AGOA, and I think too much of our trade relationship with Africa has been defined by AGOA. AGOA is subject to what they call trade preference erosion, and we have to start thinking about a new trading relationship that again puts Africa more of on an even playing field relative to our other trade relations we have with other countries. And the last point I'd make is we need to move, and I think the DFC is a good sign of this. So I think this is an element much more towards thinking about on the economic side as Africa as a place where we spend aid to Africa as a place where we invest. Yeah. And we need to think about the aid that we do spend as part of a overall investment strategy, not as purely, a aid strategy, if you will. And so all those things largely are about being a little bit broader, a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more aligned with a partnership as opposed to a donor-recipient type approach.
Okay, I'm going to do what I shouldn't do and just tell you some of my own views really quickly. But I worked in the NSC for President Obama. I spent a lot of time looking at U.S. policy, and I do think when it comes to Africa, and maybe Kath would disagree, we don't use the Oval Office, I think, effectively. I think particularly in the last administration, the Oval Office was a winner's circle, a place to coordinate, to identify the leaders that we thought were most aligned with our principles, values, and what we would, in quotes, say is a good leader. And I think in other regions, we deal with challenging partners because we have shared interests in challenges that we're trying to work together. And I'd like to see in the future, a more thoughtfulness of having to have hard conversations with people, with leaders and others that we would do with Pakistan and we would do with India. So I'm just going to throw that out there before we go to Q&A. But I've been thinking a lot about sort of the Oval Office as one of our strongest tools, and how do we use that to push policy, not just for demonstrative effect. But we, the four of us, have talked a lot, debated, and given our points, and I think it's a time that the audience has its say. So we're going to move to Q&A. It is Q, so please ask a question. I know you're ready to debate, but a question will be really useful, and we have people coming around with mics, so we'll start here in the front with Nee.
Thank you very much. My name is Nee Akwete. I am now a consultant, foreign policy. I've spent a few years in the vineyards. Judd, thank you, because I love the idea of a debate. Maybe that says something about me. But so my question is to you. Monday outed me that we were talking about democracy, and people call it governance. I prefer democracy. I think it's so important, but it is linked to security. If there is war, you are not going to have much democracy. It's linked to economic progress, because if people are desperately poor, then they question the democracy they have. So I'll just follow on the security. When you do your next security debate, I am hoping you will drill down into this question of over-militarization, because I'm from Ghana. West Africa is imploding. So you cannot tell me that the Africans have too much security help. Maybe the security help they have is not enough, or not the right kind. And if they are going to have it, I prefer that they get it from the US, not from the Europeans, because we know their history, not from the Russians or the Chinese, because they are not democratic. So please, my question is, will you do an excellent security debate? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to call on you in every panel that we have. So I'll just preview briefly the next two. We are going to talk about, one of them will be on economic investment and an argument about isn't democracy and governance integral to
growth in trade and investment. And the reason I wanted to do that, because I've heard people make the other argument that an autocracy is a place to invest in. And so we're going to try to sort that out. On the security side, we're going to talk about, I think, some of the issues you raised, Nee, but also what is the role of human rights in security assistance. Now, here's the one wrinkle. They're not going to be here in Washington. So one of the things that we're going to do is take this on the road, and we are, I won't announce where we're going, but we're talking to a couple of different venues, and we're going to do this talking to diaspora communities and university students, and then we'll come back here at the end of the fiscal year, probably around September, to do the final debate. But you can follow online, just like many people are doing now, but these issues will be tackled in the next debate. Oh, let's go to another question. Sir. And I won't privilege the front row, I promise.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. I'm very pleased that Kath raised the issue of China's role in Africa, the pros and the cons. And I noticed that of all the questions asked of the audience, this was the closest. So I wonder if we could have a little more discussion about what China is doing, what some of the problems might be associated with it, like the loss of Mombasa. And Judd, please feel free to enter it, because I know you've done very good work on the subject.
Thanks, Tom. Who wants to tackle China in Africa first?
I'll take a role in this, partly because I've evolved quite a bit on this. I mean, I voted against, so I was a B on Kath's statement. So I was on the other side. I would not have been that way a few years ago. I mean, when I first started working in Africa, I viewed China as bringing a whole lot of infrastructure, a whole lot of resources to the table, a whole lot of ability, you know, a bit of a partnership approach that I thought was beneficial. And certainly, I always viewed China when I was at the AU, that my Chinese counterpart was always eager to work together. I always viewed China as providing a net benefit in terms of African development. I think the Belt and Road Initiative has changed my view on that somewhat. Now, I wouldn't be all the way over on the way some people in this building are, that, you know, we have to fight China at every turn. I still think there are opportunities for cooperation with China, with co-option of China, with collaboration. But I think whereas previously China, I think, viewed Africa as an economic opportunity, one that was where they had a special expertise in terms of working in, you know, developing countries that they could bring to the table. I think the Belt and Road puts all that into a strategic context that is where it becomes much more about how does this fit into an overall global approach that is not 100% benign. And the one area where I think this is very concrete is the debt levels. I mean, we did a lot as a world community to clean up the balance sheets among African countries as under HIPC and MDRI. And you can look at the numbers. China's debt level, African country debt levels are now getting right back to where they were, and most of that is Chinese debt. And that is I think, a serious problem.
I'll just add in, I think the big issue, I agree with John. I think the big issue is how does the U.S. approach this? And I think the trap for us is looking at this as an area where a symmetrical response, if you will, makes sense. So in other words, if China, then the U.S. must, in a very tit-for-tat fashion. And we shouldn't be transactional in the way that the Chinese have been. I think there are some, some of that proves itself out over time, but I don't think we can stand only on that. We have to have a positive vision. We have to have something that comes to the table, and Mondi already noted the revised approach on OPIC that the United States is pursuing. Africa was not foremost in the minds of the legislators. It was really Southeast Asia, but it is a global capability, small amount of money, but again, indicates an interest by the United States to start to grow out its toolkit to be effective. And so I think that's a positive thing. I think the other piece that the United States has that the Chinese don't in the same way, is if there's one thing we have a lot of, it's lawyers. And a lot of what's happening is, contractual malfeasance that results in these effects that John's pointing to, whether it's debt or other infrastructure, specific company infrastructure-related issues as opposed to national level. So I think this is an area where, the United States, probably alongside Europe and others, can really, at a pretty small price, become much more engaged in trying to help work through how the Chinese tend to do business, and how to structure contracts, how to be careful and watchful for the types of efforts that they will do. The United States obviously itself has a significant debt challenge that is not disassociated from debt to China. So I think that is a call to look at ourselves as well as focusing on what China's doing elsewhere in the world. And genuinely, we have a lot of challenges here at home that make it hard for us to message effectively elsewhere in the world. Africa's a great example. That, we tend to want to just say no to countries. Don't do business with China. It's a lot of don'ts. Those don'ts are important, but we are hampered in our ability to be effective at that until we get ourselves together in terms of the city on the hill image alongside our own activities and how they support the message we're trying to send overseas.
Let me just add one minor thing to that, unsurprisingly from the perspective of an African citizen, which is, I think it's important to not repeat some of the errors of the Cold War, either in terms of proxies and clients in one end of the world, or in licensing impunity by creating a competitive market between the United States and China for influence in Africa. Because, if we ended up in a situation in which the United States felt it had to match China penny for dollar and dollar for cent in whatever China was doing in Africa, what it would mean basically is that irresponsible national leaders would have access to cheap money for the purpose of doing whatever they wanted to do. And ultimately, you would have a return to a world of impunity, a world of proxy conflicts and lots that you could think about. And I think that would be a piece of profound folly. Now, I've also got to be quite perfectly honest. I think I'm somewhere in the zone of ambivalence that the ambassador describes. But I do have problems whenever I go to Addis Ababa and have to go to the African Union. And I'm a conscientious objector to going into that tall building. I just am. I cannot understand. You either want to build a regional institution or you don't. So unless I really, the tall building I'm talking about, for those who know it, is the new AU headquarters. By the way, that place is built on a mass atrocity site. Ethiopians that's the biggest slaughter site in Ethiopian history for people who were killed during the occupation of Abyssinia by Il Duque in 1936-41. Now, and any Ethiopian who knows the story would know that that place was supposed to be consecrated as a national monument. It was knocked over, the memory destroyed, and Chinese listening devices planted in a building so that whatever African leaders say will be heard in Beijing. I think that's just atrocious. It's irresponsible. And I think we should say so. Now, if African leaders don't want an African Union to work, let them say so. But you cannot outsource the building of your headquarters to China and then make it the subject of something that looks respectable. It's just scandalous. That's my point of view as an African. Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add to that is we've been talking Chinese economic engagement in Africa. That economic engagement, and this is one thing that I do worry about. I understand that China gave African governments options, so I understand that. It's their decision. But that economic engagement is also comes with a governance model. So let's not kid ourselves and think it's just about the economics of it. There's definitely a governance model that is being sold along with that economic engagement. And from my perspective, and I'm sure there are many, some of my African friends have disagreed with me on this, that governance model that has been swallowed whole, basically, by some African countries is a huge ideological debate going on the African continent. And we either engage with that ideological debate on what governance looks like in Africa, or we say, continue along that path. I think that's a missing piece that I think we need to engage with as well.
Okay, why don't we do a collection of questions? So, sir, and then did you have a question out there and over here?
Hi, and thank you, CSIS, for just a tremendous program and for the work of the Open Society. Great work. And I'm just retired from OPIC, former managing director, but I was 2 years in the Office of Africa in the Commerce Department on a special detail, which I just finished up. It seems to me, Monday, you stressed the importance of governance, and I couldn't agree with you more. Ambassador Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, put forward the Africa strategy, and he talked about China quite a bit and the opaque contracts, the bribery, the corruption. Transparency International has labeled China the biggest exporter of corruption that the world has ever seen. It's the work that I did in Africa and AGOA and many other parts. It was colossal, the amount of corruption that is happening. And it has now indebted many of the countries in Africa. There are perhaps 6 or 8 countries in Africa that are in basically default. China has lent them so much money. They've gotten into an enormous debt trap, and China's sort of carrying them. China stopped carrying Venezuela, and we've now seen actually starvation in Venezuela. We've seen 4 million people flee from Venezuela. This is where some of the African countries are heading towards, unfortunately, very quickly. But my question is really, how does the US government craft a policy? We talk about, for example, Ambassador Bolton talked about the corruption, the bribery in Africa, but we don't get into specifics. I, for example, looked very carefully at the Kenya Railroad, which is perhaps the biggest single Chinese corruption that I've ever come across. $4 billion railroad. And I worked very hard to try to get the US government to call this out specifically, but it wouldn't do it. It's for those of you who don't know, Kenya had an existing railroad built by the British about 100 years ago. And the World Bank 10 years ago said to Kenya, well, we'd like to modernize this railroad. We'll give you about $400, $500 million. We'll give you a brand new railroad. China came in and said, no, you don't want to do that. They built an exactly redundant, exactly parallel railroad and has indebted Kenya now for about $3 billion that Kenya still owes. That's stealing money away from education programs in Kenya. It's stealing money away from healthcare programs in Kenya. And Kenya can't pay. This railroad cannot sustain itself. So what do we do with US policy about specific countries? How do we more effectively call out the corruption that China is pervasively carrying across Africa?
Thank you. When we'll do all 3 questions.
Hi, I'm Robert Keel. I noticed you guys we've been talking a lot about China, terrorism, and et cetera, but Africa seems to be one of the continents that's going to be most affected by climate change, and I'm wondering what you guys feel like is the U.S. role and what role should be played purely by Africa.
Thank you. And then we had a question from Patrick.
Thank you, Judd. Patrick Seward from the U.S. Treasury. I was played a small part in the development of the Africa strategy, which had the rollout with the speech from Ambassador Bolton. The question today was, does the U.S. need a foreign policy? I'd be interested in the question, does the U.S. clearly have a foreign policy for sub-Saharan Africa? The panelists, if you were forced at either threat of violence or massive monetary inducement, could you come up with, this is clearly the U.S. foreign policy towards Africa? Is there a communication and sort of outreach gap on what is the foreign policy for the United States? Thank you.
Okay, those are good questions about what should the policy be around corruption, climate change, and then what is the U.S. policy? Who wants to take the first stab? Yeah, why don't we go, John? You want to start?
Yeah. So Mark and Patrick sort of were flip sides of the same coin. We do have a policy that was announced. Now, I am much more distant from it than both of you, so I read it. My concern with the policy as it was announced is it perpetuated what I thought were too many caricatures. Caricatures of what the issues were in Africa and caricatures of, for instance, the Chinese and others. I think the situation is much more nuanced across the board, and I wish our policy was more nuanced. What I'd like to hear from Chidi and others is how they think the policy, so the question, it's one thing for us here in Washington to say if we can define what the policy is. And I think, the policy was pretty clear. It was countering China, putting a big emphasis on corruption. You both mentioned. That's at least what I read. I think there's a lot more to an African policy than just that. So I would argue that our policy needs to be much more robust than that. But do either of those, the really question thing is, are people in I wouldn't expect, a person on the street or a person in a farm to be able to say what the U.S. policy is, but in capitals across the continent, can people say what our policy is? And I'm afraid my sense is, but I would defer to others who would know better, is that they wouldn't be able to, and that's even worse. Whatever our policy is should be known by the people who are opposite numbers on the other end, and I don't know how true that is. So I think those are two areas where our policy needs to be improved. I think the issue of climate change, it's absolutely right that Africa is probably the region that will face the biggest brunt of climate change. I think that's a really great area where we can think about how we partner with African governments to try and figure out mitigation, adaptation strategies. Obviously, there's a lot we need to do to reduce the impact in general, but a lot of those impacts are already here, and part of what we need to do is think about what are the tools that we can do to help. And I'll give one example. So in Ethiopia, when I was there, there's a celebration in September, Mezcal. And Mezcal really is supposed to be the start of the rainy season. And farmers sort of plan completely around that. And for millennia, I think, that's what happened. Now, Mezcal comes, you never know when the rains are. They can come before, they can come after. Farmers wait to plant, and then the rains don't come, and then they plant, and it gets washed away. Obviously, if you had irrigation, that would go a long way towards helping farmers manage what's now a much less predictable weather cycle. And that's something we could work with on an investment approach, not a purely aid approach, to help develop investment models that can help finance that and benefit from the greater farmer agricultural productivity. So I think that is absolutely an area where the models we've talked about could be applied and applied very effectively.
I just want to side with John here. The U.S. does have a policy, but the one point I was just going to emphasize is this point that it is not well understood on the continent. And that's a problem for us because I cannot tell you how many countries I have been to where I have been asked, what is your policy? And I pull out the strategy and I give it to them because I travel with it everywhere I go. We sort of have a discussion around that, but they're not seeing the translation of that policy on the ground, is the impression I'm getting. So that was the only point I was going to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States has chosen a national security strategy focused largely around what it calls great power competition. And I share Chidi's concerns. Look, I understand why that is. I'm a security person at heart. There are reasons for that I think are valuable. But it is becoming oversimplified in many areas, and I think Africa policy is one where we're seeing that quickly happen. So it is an important lens. I don't in any way dismiss the challenge presented by China's actions and potential actions going forward in Africa, but it's not the only lens. So with regard to corruption, I think, yes, the Chinese are purveyors of corruption, perpetrators of corruption. Lots of other autocracies are as well. And I think we should be, this is a good example of where it's fine if the hook is through China, if that's what galvanizes interest in Washington. But I think there really is this much larger challenge that we have between the sort of the ability to have transparent financing, public knowledge, et cetera, and a lot of darkness in the global environment around financing that is creating just bottom line national security challenges for the United States and others. And we, the United States, are in our small ways, if you will, a party to that as well at times. So it's about tightening. Again, I'm just going to emphasize continually, it's not just about what happens overseas, it's about what we do here and how that translates into our foreign policy. So we have to work here at home to get ourselves in the right place, and then I think we can be a much better example and advocate for activities abroad. So I'll say that. Climate change is a great issue to have brought up. I think both Africa and Asia will be very heavily hit. Obviously, it's existential for several nations in the Pacific, Marshall Islands, et cetera. In Africa, we're seeing already a significant crossover between the ability to govern, the challenges to the ability to govern, and where climate impacts are happening earliest. And those combinations are, again, if nothing else, it's a hook for the United States national security community to be able to say, what does that create in terms of national security challenges that we, who tend to look inward a lot, might someday have to deal with. Obviously, it's again, existential for people inside Africa, but I think it creates an opportunity for us to demonstrate how if we don't get a handle on adaptation and mitigation today, if we don't think far enough ahead to how we will pay literally price for not dealing with a lot of these issues today, it's going to be a net negative, to say the least, for the United States.
Maybe let me try and return to where I started. In many ways, the Horn of Africa is the one place that serves as a control for my underlying hypothesis. Unlike other parts of Africa where the United States has got partners who have long-standing historical links, you talk of Kenya, the Brits are there, you talk of Cote d'Ivoire, the French are there, you talk of Angola, the Portuguese are there. There is, the Horn of Africa does not have any historical colonizer. And that's the place where this contest between the United States and China in many ways is playing out in the most corrosive fashion. And it's not just United States, US money and Chinese money, it's also Gulf money. And then there is the terror money from the Gulf of Eden. And it seems to me that we could possibly ramify this conversation beyond the polarities of US and China, because in the Gulf, in the Horn of Africa, you've got lots of sources of money. And that is stretching right down now to even Uganda. And you actually see the physical consequences. Whenever you land in any of those countries, you look today, and you return in 12 months, the difference is clear. And you can quite simply tell where the money has come from, whether it is from the terror money in the Gulf of Eden, or from China, or from the Gulf, or from the United States, or from France. And I cannot possibly tell you, on this side, what the policy instruments should be for dealing with this. But it seems to me that that's got to be dealt with. There's got to be a response and some vision for how to deal with it in some form, because if there isn't, the consequences will come back to bite all of us, and quite soon too. Climate change is a bit of a difficulty for me, because to design policy around climate change, first of all, you've got to not deny climate change. And so I can't tell deniers of climate change and its impacts how to do policy on climate change. That's left for people in the United States to sort out through democratic means. And if you've got a government that believes that climate change is a problem to begin with, then it seems to me we get into the question of how to deal with policy making around that. But as long as deniers run government, it seems to me the best you can do is to have people-to-people dialogue, working within existing legal frameworks and mechanisms of international cooperation to see how we can mitigate, to see how we can educate, to see how we can collaborate, and prepare for a time when a more coherent framework for policy making, a more desirable framework for policy making is possible. And let me end on this note. There's a lot positive that's even within the framework of a security-sensitive policy mindset. There's a lot that's happening in Africa in which the United States can be a positive partner. And Mondes made the point with governance as an index. If you looked at, and the ambassador has talked about the relevance of regional institutions. If you looked at West Africa, only in the past fortnight, ECOWAS has forced the government in Guinea-Bissau to commit to elections, forced out a prime minister that was foisted on the country, and Nigeria has written a check to back that situation up. In South Sudan, Nigeria has written a check, another check, to try and become an advocate for accountability in South Sudan, just in the past 8 days. And that is something that says there are actually positive things that are happening and positive possibilities. And Nigeria and West Africa and Senegal came together to force out a president, a murderous president that was unwilling to leave in the Gambia and is stabilizing the place. Now, all of these are situations that engage international peace and security. Most of them will be issues for the Permanent Five to deal with. They have outsourced to African countries, and African countries are carrying the load in a lot of these countries. Burundi is another example. Some of them, sometimes imperfectly, at other times with some difficulty, but efforts are being made. And it seems to me that there's an outstretched hand. The question is the United States willing to take responsibility and accept the outstretched hand? And when it does, it seems to me that the United States is at its best when it is willing to provide leadership and provide partnership in those contexts. Thank you.
Well, I don't think we could have ended on a better note. Please, a round of applause for our debaters. Stay tuned for the next debate in a couple of months, and please make sure to turn your clickers in. We need these things. Thanks. You can leave yours there.